My name is Harriet Louise Wyndham, born Harriet Louise Crane, on the 3rd day of May in the year 1835 in Pendleton District, South Carolina. I am 81 years old as I speak these words. I have lived long enough to watch the world remake itself twice over, and still I say without hesitation that nothing in all my 81 years, not the war, not the fever seasons, not the deaths I have sat beside, nothing ever reached into me the way that one night did. I was 9 years old, and I have never once, in 72 years of living, forgotten a single hour of it. Most people who hear the word fear think they understand what it means. They do not truly. Not until they have lain flat in the dark with their hand pressed over their own mouth to keep the sound inside, listening to something move through the house that should not have been moving. That night taught me what fear actually is. Not the feeling, the knowledge, the understanding that the world outside the walls of everything you trust does not care, in the slightest measure, whether you survive it. But to understand what happened that night, you must first understand the place and the life I came from. Pendleton District in those years was hill country, old land, red clay under the pine straw, farms cut out of woodland that had been cleared by hand, going back 2 generations before my own. My father, Samuel Crane, worked 80 acres on the eastern edge of the district, tobacco on the lower ground, corn on the upper slopes where the soil ran thinner and more stubborn. He was a man of medium height and maximum patience, quiet in the way that men who work alone in fields tend to become quiet. Not cold, simply inward. He reserved his words for things that required them. My mother, Agnes Crane, née Albright, was his opposite in most respects. She was quick, sharp-minded, a woman who ran the household the way a mill runs water, constantly, efficiently, without apparent effort. She had 5 children to account for, and she accounted for all of us with a precision that left no room for disorder. We were not wealthy. We were not wanting. We existed in that particular middle condition of a Southern farm family in the 1840s, which meant the work was always present and the weather was always the final word on everything. Our house sat at the end of a half-mile lane off the main road, surrounded on 3 sides by timber. The nearest neighbor, a man named Forsyth with a small place and a large family, was nearly 2 miles west along a path that ran through a creek bottom. My father said that was close enough for comfort and far enough for peace, and he meant it as a compliment to the arrangement. The timber pressed close on all sides, and at night, particularly in the autumn months when the wind moved through the upper branches, the house sat in a sound that was constant and large and not entirely tame. I was 9 years old in the October of 1844. My father had ridden out on a Tuesday morning to a farm auction 22 miles north in Spartanburg District, and was not expected back until Thursday at the earliest. This was not unusual. He made 2 or 3 such trips each year, and my mother managed the house and the farm work during his absence, with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. There was nothing in that Tuesday morning that announced itself as different from any other. My father rode out at first light. My mother stood on the porch and watched him go. I was behind her in the doorway, still pulling on my shoes. That evening, my mother put the 5 of us to bed in the ordinary way. I shared a room with my sisters Ruth, who was 12, and little Della, who was 6. My 2 brothers, James and Henry, slept in the small room off the kitchen. The house was still by 8:30. My mother sat by the fire in the main room with her mending, which was the last thing I saw before I closed my eyes. I do not know what time it was when I woke. There was no clock in our room, and the fire had burned low enough that the light through the gap under the door was only a faint orange thread. What woke me was sound. Not a loud sound. That is the thing that has stayed with me all these years. It was not a crash or a shout or anything that announces itself as danger. It was a quiet sound, a slow, deliberate creak from the front of the house, the particular sound of a floorboard taking weight. I lay still. I told myself it was my mother, still awake, moving to add wood to the fire. But the sound did not move the way my mother moved. My mother moved quickly and with purpose, the way she did everything. This sound moved slowly. It paused, then moved again, paused. The kind of movement that belongs to a person who is trying not to be heard. Ruth was awake beside me. I could tell by the quality of her stillness. There is a difference between a sleeping person's stillness and a frightened one's, and even at 9 years old, I understood it precisely. I reached out in the dark and found her hand. She gripped mine back so hard, I felt my fingers pressed together. The sound moved along the front wall, paused at the door to the main room. Then we heard my mother's voice, very low, very controlled. The voice she used when she intended to leave no room for argument. She said, "Who is there?" 2 words, flat and plain. Not a question, a statement with a question attached to it. No answer came. Then my mother said it again, louder this time, and there was a sound of movement from her side of the door, the familiar scrape of the iron poker being lifted from the hearth-stand. My mother kept that poker for the fire, and I believe she kept it for other reasons as well, though she never said so. What followed were perhaps the longest 3 minutes of my life. There was movement in the main room, then the sound of the front door, then my mother's voice again outside, sharper now, carrying the full authority of a woman who has decided she will not be frightened in her own house. Then silence, a long silence. Then her footsteps returning across the porch, and the door closing firmly, and the sound of the bar being seated. She opened our bedroom door. She was holding the lamp in one hand and the poker in the other. She looked at us, all 3 of us sitting upright in the bed with our eyes wide, and she said in a perfectly even voice, "It was nothing. Go back to sleep." We did not go back to sleep. I lay rigid until the gray came into the window and I heard the roosters start. Ruth held my hand until dawn. Little Della slept through the entire thing, which I have always regarded as either a great blessing or evidence that she was simply a more sensible child than either of us. In the morning, my mother told us that a man had come to the door in the night, a stranger passing through. She said he had asked for water, and she had told him to use the creek, and he had gone on his way. She said it with the same tone she used to report the weather or the state of the corn, and she never spoke of it again. I believed her for several years. I was perhaps 14 or 15 before I began to revisit the details with the understanding I had not possessed at 9. A man who wants water knocks. He does not move slowly along the front wall in the dark. He does not go silent when asked who is there. And my mother, who was afraid of very little in this world and made no particular effort to conceal it when she was. My mother did not come into our room with a lamp and a fire iron over a man who had asked for water. I did not ask her about it. By the time I was old enough to frame the question honestly, enough years had passed that it felt like an excavation neither of us needed to undertake. She had protected us from whatever it was that night, and she had protected us afterward by making it small, by giving it the shape of an ordinary thing, so that her daughters could go on sleeping in that house without the walls closing in around them. I understood this eventually as an act of care so precise and deliberate that it took me decades to fully appreciate what it had required of her. My father came home on Thursday, as expected. My mother told him nothing, or if she did, she told him in private, because he never mentioned it to us children. The farm went on as farms do. The tobacco came in that autumn, and the yield was fair. Winter arrived on schedule. The night retreated into the category of things that are known but not spoken of, which is where most of the significant things in a family's life tend to reside. But I want to tell you what that night gave me, because it gave me something, strange as that may sound. It gave me the first clear understanding I ever had of what my mother actually was. Not the woman at the fire with the mending, not the voice that called us in from the fields, the woman who stood in the dark with a lamp and a poker between her children and whatever stood on the other side of that door. That woman. I had lived 9 years in the same house with her and had not understood until that night what she was made of, what the true composition of her was. She never sought recognition for it. She would have found the idea that her children might admire her for such a thing entirely unnecessary. She had done what was in front of her to do, the way she always did, and that was the end of her accounting of the matter. But I have thought about her in that doorway more times than I can number in 72 years. In my own hard nights, and I have had them, I have returned to the image of her standing there, lamp in one hand, iron in the other, voice flat and controlled and absolutely immovable. I have told my own daughters, when the occasion called for it, the scariest thing in any room is not always the thing you are afraid of. Sometimes it is the person who refuses to be. I do not know with certainty what was on the other side of that door in October of 1844. I have my beliefs. The road in those years carried men that the road is not meant to carry, and a farm with the husband away and 5 children inside and a woman alone was a known kind of target for a known kind of man. My mother knew this. She had known it from the moment my father rode out that Tuesday morning. She had already accounted for it before the sun went down. She died in the winter of 1889. She was 71 years old, and she died in the same house where that night occurred, in the same main room where she had once stood, with a lamp and a poker in the dark. She died in her own bed with her children around her, which is the death she had earned and the death she deserved. I never asked her what she saw that night. I never asked her whether she was afraid. I know the answer to the second question regardless. She was afraid. She would have been inhuman not to have been. But she stood there anyway, and the door held, and the morning came, and we were all of us still in our beds when it did. That is the whole of what I know about the scariest night of my life. It was not the darkness that frightened me most, in the end. It was the silence after my mother said, "Who is there?" and nothing answered. That silence. That is what I have carried, because in that silence was every possible version of what the night might become, and my mother stood between all of it and us, alone, with the fire going low, and she did not move an inch. She did not move an inch. And that, I think, is the most important thing one person can ever do for another.